Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Shvi is Pedig Vav, Halacha Gimel, and Halacha Dalid. We are learning today Daf Nun. We left off on Daf Nun Amid Aleph, 3 lines from the top of the Amid by the dot Rabbi Abohu. And let's quickly go back to the machlokes that we had yesterday regarding the following. When you have an onion that was picked on the 6th year, it's an onion of the 6th. If it was left on the ground, and you know because of the color of the leaves that the new growth came from the nourishment it took from the ground on the 7th year, that's clearly L'Kula Alma in the Mishnah that classifies the entire onion as an onion of the 7th year. If that onion that grew on the 6th, that had some additional growth on the 7th, had yet more additional growth on the 8th, that for sure is the last line in the Mishnah that this becomes now an onion of the 8th. Gedulin mevatlin ha'ikr that was applied from the gedulin of the 7th that transformed the 6th. The same logic will apply now on this onion when you have the gedulim that went even more from the 8th that transformed the gedulim of the 7th. However, where do we have a machlokes? What happens if you plant an onion on the 7th? The ikir grew on the 7th. You uprooted it. You left it on the ground. And because of its connection to the ground, it took nourishment from the ground on the 8th, and more grew on the 8th. If what grew now on the 8th is more than everything that was there until then, here we have the machlokes between Rabbi Lo and Rav Imi that say it still remains a product of the 7th year, and Rav Ze'era, who holds that Mikiven Sheraba Olav Achadosh, even though the Ikr grew on the 7th, even though there's a logic to say that something that is coming out of a Peda that's Asur, meaning it's part of the 7th year, will always be classified as such, says Rab Ze'eda, no, we don't do that. That the moment you have Roiv, a simple majority, yes, the Roiv will transform this Betzel, and it will be classified as an 8th year onion. So we're going to begin today, continuing more about this machlokes all the way up until the new Mishnah, until Halacha Dalid. And Halacha Dalid will discuss various new topics. First topic will be, I know we spoke about this regarding the luf above in the Lamids. The question now will be, how long after Shvius can one assume that the vegetables being marketed, in the shuk, whatever, what the vegetables being marketed are no longer Shvius produce? That will be the first topic of the Mishnah. And really, it's going to boil down to a machlokes tanoim, whether you have to wait for what? Wait for if people who had no Peder Shvius began to work the land again on the 8th year, and they planted vegetables. Do you have to wait for when the product of the 8th year is already readily available? That's one option. Or you can have it immediately after the Shemitah year, as we'll see details why yeah and why not. We will also address in the Mishnah certain categories of produce that are forbidden to be exported from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. And there are 2 such items. Number one may not export Shemen Sreifa, which means Truma oil that became Tameh, therefore it can only be used for burning. That may not be exported to Chutz La'aretz. And also one may not export Peiros Shvi'is to Chutz La'aretz, as we'll see in the Mishnah, all of the reasons why. We will also discuss the prohibition of bringing Trumas Chutz La'aretz, which is only a rabbinic truma, into Eretz Yisrael. Really, we're going to learn regarding the prohibition of bringing Trumas Chutz La'aretz into the Holy Land, that we differentiate between bringing it into the center of the land, which will be prohibited, versus bringing that into the border cities, which, as we will see, will be permitted. And as we'll see in the Mishnah, at some point, the ban of importing Bechlal vegetables from Chutz La'aretz into Eretz Yisrael, they made that ban because since the Chachamim made a Gezerah during the times of the Second Temple, that the land itself of Chutz La'aretz might have in it a fragment of a human remain, which in parts Tuma, they made it rabbinic that all lands of Eretz Amim in parts Tuma. So the Chachamim did not want you to bring vegetables from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, because that's the way it works with vegetables. When you do business with vegetables, many times, I know now the world is a new world, the vegetables come along with clods of earth. And they didn't want for such clods of earth to be brought into the Holy Land. So there was a time where it was usher to import vegetables from out of Israel into Israel, but at some point, that ban was lifted. All of this will be in today's Daf Nun, Daf Nun Amud Aleph, again, 3 lines from the top of the Amid, Rabbi Abo. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Abo went to a city called Arbeil. Arbeil is a city near Tiberia. And V'iskabel Gaba Amir Bar Binyamin, and he was hosted by the host Abba Bar Binyamin. Is Atoin Visho'alon Leibo Ilen Batzlayom. While Rabbi Bo was there, people came to ask him regarding the topic of the Machloikes, which is regarding onions that grew on the 7th year. That's when the Iker grew. But then they developed new growths on the 8th year. All right, they were plucked on the 7th, and they were replanted on the 8th, or they were left on the ground, and they took nourishment from the ground. And these new growths actually exceeded everything that was there from the 7th. You had a case where there was majority of what is from the 8th. Mamish the Machloikis, Rab Ze'eda would hold that no problem. It's not classified at all as a product of the 7th year. And indeed, V'hoidei loin kahadod Rab Ze'eda. So Rabbi Bo paskin like Rab Ze'eda, which is, he quoted his words, that Mekivin Sharaba Olav HaChadosh, therefore it's mutter. However, when Chamsoin Semichin Ilavei, when he saw that people were actually relying on his psak din, he hesitated. And Amar Loin, and he said, 1 second, Ani lo yamarti elam, I only paskent like Rab Ze'eda b'meduchanim, only when the onions are crushed. In other words, when you cut up the onion, we're speaking about the growth of the 7th year, and the additional, everything was cut up together, and they were mixed together. There and only there do I paskin like Rab Ze'eda, that since the majority of what it is came from the 8th year, the minority is batal in the majority. But if you don't crush them up, I didn't mean to say that with just the way it is, it's already considered a product of the 8th year. Now, is that
I'm sorry,
what
what
he
percentage? What percentage should be from the new year versus the
51% or 50.1, a simple majority. Now, this did he have a change of mind? Is it that he didn't clarify what he said in the outset? The Gemara will discuss it. So Amar Rav Yudah bar Pazi, Ano Yoda Roisha v'Soifai. I know what happened. I know what happened. In other words, originally, he didn't mean to limit his psak din. When Rabbi Bo said, no, since you have majority of the onion grew on the 8th, it's good. It didn't need to be crushed. Why did he paskin that way? Because originally Rabbi Bo, who never heard any dissenting opinion, he only heard the opinion of Rab Ze'eda. But Kad, Dishma, Rab Lo, Rab Imi, Pligin, the moment he heard that others, Rabbi Lo, Rab Imi, like we learned yesterday, argue with Rab Ze'eda. So Shra Mina means he walked back from his psak din, which is quite amazing. In other words, when he says it has to be crushed, he actually himself had a change of mind. He became informed with more information, and he says, now that there is a machloikes, I will only paskin like Rab Ze'eda in the case that it was crushed. Okay, let's. What was that?
During the 8th year and stuff?
Yeah, this whole thing happened on the 8th year, correct. Okay, says the new Mishnah. And like we mentioned, the first topic of this Mishnah, to some degree, we learned about this in our dafim on Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis regarding the luf. We had this conversation and we quoted this Mishnah. Our Mishnah is speaking about all vegetables. And the question is, the issue is, From when is one allowed to buy in the market vegetables, which is in the 8th year, the year following the 7th year. So guys, like this. First of all, most vegetables that grow during Shvius are in the category of svichem. What I'm saying is that we're not speaking about only a fear that someone be'isur planted and harvested vegetables on Shvius. We're speaking even stam. Even without working the land, there's a phenomenon that at times, through nature, a certain bee took a seed of a vegetable, left it on the ground, and there are things that grow without human involvement. Anything that grows from a seed that went into the ground on the 7th and it became ready on the 7th, that is called sfichem, aftergrowths. Even though mido'eraisa, one is allowed to consume it the way you consume other produce of Shvius. Like we mentioned before, the Chachamim said that you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to eat it. They were afraid that people would purposefully plant vegetables and then claim out grew by itself. So generally, sfichem, which refers to vegetables, that's not referring to fruits. Fruits grow, of course, I planted a tree and every year there's residual. Every year the tree produces fruits. We're speaking about vegetables, something that needs to be planted every year for it to grow one time. Sfichem are also midrabanan. Okay, now the question is, first of all, which sfichem are also midrabanan? Only if you plucked it on the 7th year. Another rule, if something, so to say, began to grow on its own, but you only took it out of the ground on the 8th, there's no problem with that. What we are concerned is that someone will pluck it on the 7th, sell it on the 8th, and say that what? And say that it was plucked on the 8th when really it was taken out of the ground on the 7th. In other words, there's a fear that what you are buying in the market is sfichem. I want to add another parenthesis that we quoted not yesterday. I think that there was a Tosfos that says, we keep on quoting the Shita, that yerek basar likutoi isuroi doesn't mean it follows the year in which it was actually picked. What it does mean is that it follows the year when it reached its full maturity, when it's ready to be picked. So be that as it may, the problem with buying vegetables in the beginning of the 8th year is that we are afraid that perhaps this vegetable is sfichim of the 7th year, which is asur midrabanan. The one who is selling it is claiming that it's from the 8th year. Either that it was ready.
Is it asur both ramachal behema v'machal adam, Rabbi? I know I can't
make a difference. Makes no difference. Sfichem are asur midrabanan. Chazal were afraid that you're going to plant it and say it grew by itself. Sfichem that are asur midrabanan are products only of the 7th year. If something began to grow on its own on the 7th and it became readied and picked on the 8th, there's no problem. But if it was readied or picked on the 7th and now it's being sold on the 8th and the guy is saying, I just picked this on the 8th, there's a fear that maybe it came from the 7th. And therefore says the Mishnah that indeed, from when are you allowed to buy marketed vegetables? Only if this type of vegetable that you are buying, you're buying a carrot. If this were to be planted in the 8th year, of course not Rosh Hashanah, you can't work on Rosh Hashanah, but whenever in the beginning when you could work. I don't know how it works. Let's say it would take 30 days for it to grow fully. Whatever the time is, only from the time where this vegetable, if it was planted on the 8th, would have been ready the way the one that you're buying is ready, that is when you are allowed to buy it in the market with the presumption that what you're
what's the
buying
difference between this and Beshas Lekitato Isuro? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're saying good. Yeah, vegetables.
So, yes, what's the difference? If here I'm allowed and here is not allowed, what's the difference between the two?
If I have carrots, let's go with the general shita. I have carrots, and they grew on their own, and they were ready at the end of the 7th year. Chazal were afraid, and if I pick them on the 7th year, they are usher to be consumed midrabanan. Svichesh. No, I'm going to sell it in the market in the first month of the 8th year. I'm going to claim that no, it only was ready on the 8th. By the way, if that would have happened, then it wouldn't have been a problem. I didn't plant it be'isr, it grew on its own, If it was only harvested on the 8th, then it's a product of the 8th year, because basar likutei isuri, there would be no problem. The Chazal were afraid that maybe it was picked on the 7th year. Or maybe it was mature fully on the 7th year, according to that opinion. And because of that, they said very simple, that for you to buy new vegetables on the 8th year, you have to wait misheyeyasa, until when this type of vegetable, the ones that were planted on the 8th year, would be ready on the 8th year. Now, everything in the market is assumed to come from the 8th year. Also, habakir, furthermore, here there is a leniency. When it comes to vegetables, certain locations, certain lands, because of the land, because of the moisture in the air, they actually allow the vegetables to ripen earlier. Earlier ripening vegetables are, it's like a bchor, bakir. Afil means latecomers, baby boomers. So the Mishnah says, at least the leniency, that if in the Holy Land, there are certain areas, let me go to the carrot, that the carrot needs a month. So when you go to the market in Cheshvan, it's shaykh that these carrots were planted on the 8th year. But what happens if I live in a locality that over there, where I am in, the carrots need 2 months? We don't say that in my locality I have to wait 2 months. What we do say is that since people generally, we're going with the presumption that people keep shviz. So people buy in one location in Eretz Yisrael vegetables from another location where over there it was already ready. So we use asa habakid once the earlier ripening locations already have their vegetable developed, so it's mishayei. Not only are you allowed to buy the vegetable on that location, but hitin ha'afil, even if you are in the market, in that location of the market, that vegetable needs more time for it to become ripe. You can buy it over there, because we assume that the ones that are being sold in the market of the afil, they were bought from the Bakid area and they're being sold over there.
Right, question. Sorry. So are we in the prior thing you said, we're assuming he picked it on the 7th year, the carrots. He sat on it and wait till it's the 8th year, and then he's selling it, correct?
That's right, because he knew.
How long would it last?
Huh?
It's not going to last that long.
That's not true, because people knew how to preserve vegetables by putting them in the ground, which we already learned before is allowed to be done on Shvius.
So we're assuming he's lying about 2 things. One, that it's not sevichim, and one that
no. Only one thing, that it's svichem. That's it. Maybe
okay.
One lie. Yeah, we're afraid that maybe he's selling svichem, and people would lie because people feel that really svichem is not even asur. Svichem is not even asur midoraisa. It's a rabbinic prohibition. I know my land. I did not plant carrots. I have 10 pans of carrots. It grew on its own.
Right.
And if it would have been ready on the beginning of the 8th year, let's say it took root in the middle of Elul. Let's say it takes a month. In the middle of Tishrei, it's ready. If that would be the case, it's also not a problem.
Right.
That's what Yakir was saying, because vegetables is basar likitusa yisudai. What we are afraid is that it was harvested at the end of the 7th, or it was fully ready at the end of the 7th. Midrabanan it's asur. So what do? We wait until the products of the 8th. That product of the 8th is already ripe. Okay, now comes from the left field a piece of information that will change everything. Now, as we mentioned in the words of introduction, that at some point there was a prohibition of importing vegetables into the Holy Land always, not only Shvi'is, always. Since the Chazal said that Gush Eretz Ha'amim, that the earth of any place out of Israel, maybe you have a fragment of a human remain, and we don't want for tumas mace to spread in the Holy Land. So they says you cannot, if you touch the land, you become tummy. You go into the outside of Israel, you become tummy. In the business of vegetables come from the ground. It's not unusual that when you are selling vegetables, I'm not talking about now with modern machinery, even now, but for sure then, there were clods of earth together with the vegetables. When you bought vegetables, earth came with it, because you're taking it out of the earth. Chazal therefore said, at a certain point, that you're not allowed to import vegetables to Israel, period. Why am I saying this over here? Because when I'm buying a carrot in the middle of Tishrei, so we're saying, we are afraid that it's Sfichem Shviz. Don't forget that product that grows outside of Eretz Yisrael is not subject to Shviz. Maybe the product that you're buying came out of Israel. No, we don't do that because you're not allowed to import. As we will see, Rabbeinu HaKadosh removed that ban. So since Rebbe allowed for products that grew outside of Eretz Yisrael to be imported, so when you buy a product on the 8th year, you can assume that it came from Chutz La'aretz. And therefore there's no Svichim.
How did Rabbi overcome the dirt on the rule of the dirt on the vegetable?
I'll tell you how. Because if the dirt would have been corpse, he can't overcome it. Any rabbinic rule, Rebbe had a Sanhedrin. Any rabbinic rule could be undone or could be modified by another ruling. And once Chazal found it important, as we'll explain in a moment, to allow vegetables to come into Israel, because there was no vegetables. So we'll see the reasons. There can be sometimes very practical reasons. So now everything changes. It's gavaldik. Let's look inside the Mishnah. Rebbe hiter likach yorak b'matzoi shvius miyad, because of sins, again, Rebbe lishitasoi, Rebbe who took away the ban, this is gavaldik. Why are you saying that what you're buying now grew svichem, not svichem? No, what you're buying right now came from Chutz La'aretz. And there's no shvius in Chutz La'aretz. It changes the whole equation. And then not only that, once they were matir, importing roid vegetables came from Chutz La'aretz. So there's no chashash at all. Givaldik. More, guys, we're coming back to this in the Gemara. Now, another topic in the Mishnah. There were two items that Chazal prohibited to export from the Holy Land outside. Two products, which are, says the Mishnah, number one, Ein moitzin shemen sreifa. Chevra, shemen sreifa means truma oil that became tamei. As we mentioned many times, unlike kachim, if kachim becomes tamei, it's asur bahana. Got to burn it. Psuli amigdashim. Truma that becomes tamei is not asur bahana. It's kohen's property. The kohen can get hana. Now you can benefit from burning something, either for warmth or for fuel. So let's give an example. If oil became tamei, you're not allowed to eat the oil, but what could you do with the oil? You can burn it. It's the kohen's for burning. So says the Mishnah that if a person has this type of, a kohen has shemen sreifa, that person is not allowed to export it outside Eretz Yisrael. Question is, why? Now I want to say like this. Truma Tahoira, we just mentioned. Any Truma Tahoira can never go to outside of Israel. Why not? Vaited, because you have Tumas Eretz Amim. The gush of Eretz Amim is Tamei. You're not allowed to be Metamei Truma, even if the Truma is only rabbinic. But if the Truma is Tamei anyway, so you would think, if it's Tamei anyway, I can take it out of Eretz Yisrael. No, you cannot. Now, the reason why Chazal made this takana, listen to the beautiful idea. Just like we find by Kachim, Psulei HaMikdashim have to be burned. Do you remember, guys, we learned this together. Where do you burn Psulei HaMikdashim? You have to burn it in the borders in which it needed to be eaten if it would not become puzzle. So actually, Kachim, if it became Tamei, needed to be burned in the Azara. Kachim Kalim could have been burned in the Yerushalmi. Remember when we were learning this in Zvachim, it was so geschmack to chap it. You know, why were there different fires to burn different psuli amigdashim? Because the rule is that you can only burn it within the boundaries where it would have been eaten had it not become puzzle. Chachamim said we will apply the same rule to truma. Since we just explained that truma tohoira is not allowed to be taken out of Eretz Yisrael, once they said gush Eretz Amim is tamei. So even if the truma became tamei, you would argue if the truma is tamei anyway, let me take it out. Let the kohen use it for his fuel when he's going outside of Eretz Yisrael. We don't say that. The Chachamim said, no, you can only burn it in where you would have needed to eat it had it been tohoira. Rule number one. Rule number two, Peidah Shvi, is that Chachamim banned exporting Peidah Shvi is. Now there are two parts to that Gezeda. Number one is Peidah Shvi is subject to biur. Biur must be done in Eretz Yisrael. That's one understanding of it. Not that you might not do it. Biur let's go with that Ramban. You have to declare it ownerless, and then you can take it back. It has to be done in the Holy Land. So how can you export it when there is a expiration date on all of these products? And once it reaches the time of biur, it won't be in Eretz. You won't be able to do biur. That's one reason. That's a rabbinic ban, because you can argue midoraisa. No. Export it. Let everyone know that it has to be returned to the Holy Land. You understand? And that theoretically could have worked, but that's one reason why they made an issue. There's another understanding that even more than that, there are many rules that we didn't yet learn, but we keep on mentioning it. You can't do schayda with Peiros Shvius. There's a certain amount of reverence that we give to the product of Shvius. B'chlal, to food, there's a certain amount of kavod we give to food. Remember the whole topic Shmuel in Masechta Brachas. Can you throw bread? B'chlal, we're not mevaze oichlin ubefrat Shvius product. There's more kedusha in it. And Chazal were afraid that if you remove the Peiros of Shvius to Chutz La'aretz, people won't treat it as Peiros Shvius. Be that as it may, these are the two bands to remember. Emitzi and Sheman Sreifa or Peiros Shvius. You know where this comes into play? When it comes to the Sukkos, when it comes to the Esrogim. Remember that? Or to the Lolavim. By the Shvius here. How do they B'chlal export it? This is part of the issues. And they tell you have to ship it back. Remember that with the esrog? If your esrog came from Eretz Yisrael, this is connected to our Mishnah. So these are the two dinim. And now turning to the Daf Nun Amud Beis. Omar Rabbi Shamati beferish. Rabbi is not arguing, but Rabbi is adding a detail. Shem moitziin lesuria ve'ein moitziin chutza la'aretz. Zok der Asher Ilio, look inside the top right. Shemoitzi and Lasuria Peiros Shvius. You are allowed to take it into Syria. Even though we said there is a ban to remove Peiros Shvius from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, you can take it into Syria. V'tama, look inside the Rash. Dilma Savar Kibush Yachid Shemei Kibush. Wow, bomb. Like, how would he allow it? So now that Asher Elio is giving us a possibility that all of the dinim that we began in this chapter about Syria.
So I didn't remain Syria, Rabbi, because by kibush there is a kinyan. So now it's, if I understand correctly,
there is a kinyan, but let's go with Tosfos that since the lands outside the biblical borders of the Holy Land were conquered prior to the conquest of the entire Eretz Yisrael, the kedusha that comes together with kibush was not effective over there. Right? We gave this mashal.
I remember that 2 days ago, but the Kenyan doesn't make
There
sense.
is a Kenyan. There is a Kenyan. We conquered the land, but it wasn't fully Eretz Yisrael. So first of all, Rash Rilya was suggesting that maybe Rebbe holds Surya is bona fide Eretz Yisrael. That would be a big chiddush, because that would mean he would argue with everything we learned until now. In the second line of the Rash Rilya, Shema, Kivin Dunahago Bashvias, they used to practice rabbinic, some of Shvias. There was no biur there, but at least you're not allowed to work the land in Surya. That's what we learned. Deloy Nevad. That's the word. So this whole thing, let's go with the second reason that we explained, that they were afraid that if you will export Peiros Shvius l'chutz la'aretz, people won't be noye kedushas Peiros Shvius to the product. They will be in Surya because they are familiar with Shvius. That's what he's saying. Beautiful. And now, finally, the final topic of our Mishnah. Now we're going to go in the opposite direction. Regarding, listen to this, a prohibition, it's amazing, of bringing Truma from Chutz La'aretz into Eretz Yisrael. Now, when we speak about Trumas Chutz La'aretz, there are two opinions. Let's go with the one that we are learning, that it was very limited then. Only in the four lands of Ammon, Moav, we're speaking about the parts of Ammon and Moav that were conquered by Sichon, and therefore Yidden settled there until they were exiled by Sancheriv, and Mitzrayim, amazing, and Shinar, which refers to Bavel, and Surya. That these lands, since they are adjacent to Holy Land, rabbinically, some Trumas Umaisres, as we'll see. And like Vlad pointed out, sometimes Shvius, sometimes not Shvius. Some of that rabbinically has to be taken off. So if a person has Truma from Chutz La'aretz, rabbinic Truma, says that Truma, says the Mishnah, Ein Mevi'en Truma Mechutz La'aretz La'aretz. And guys, I know it's late, so let's leave this for the Gemara. Like, why not? Okay. Amar Rebbe, says Rebbe, as Rebbe made a comment before regarding the issue of exporting Peiroi Shvius l'chutz la'aretz, that it does not apply to Surya. By the way, I want to go back to the top line of the Amid. That Shomitzian l'Surya ve'ein moitzian chutz la'aretz. Ein moitzian l'chutz la'aretz will mean that you cannot take Peiroi Shvius from Surya into chutz la'aretz. For the same logic. No, it's for the same logic that the Rebbe says that you are allowed to bring Peiroi Shvius, biblical, from Eretz Yisrael into Surya. Let's go with the second explanation of the Rash Sirilio, because people are noyek Shvius, partly. They don't plant. They don't have beer, but they don't plant. Well, you cannot take the rabbinic Peiroi Shvius of Surya into Chutz La'aretz. Can't go from Surya into Iraq with those products. Now over here Rebbe is doing the same thing. Once we establish the general rule, the rabbinic rule that we'll explain in the Gemara, that ein mivi'en truma mei chutz la'aretz, he limits it. Shomati befeidish, I heard explicitly as our expression. We're going to go with the girsa shemivi'en, that yes, shemivi'en misuria, you are allowed to bring trumais that were separated rabbinically from product that grew in Surya. They are allowed to be brought into the Holy Land. And the same thing. But oy bazoi, you cannot bring peiros, let's say that grew in Ammon and Moav, into Surya. Truma. The ein mevi'en mechutz la'aretz. The same thing Rabbeinu HaKadosh did with peiros shvius, he's doing with trumas chutz la'aretz. Ammon and Moav did not lose the kedusha regarding this rabbinic peiros.
You can bring it from Syria.
So Nachman, Rebbe holds you can bring it from Syria into Israel. But you would not be allowed to bring meiser that you separated from product that grew in Eretz Amoin. You cannot bring it into Surya.
You could bring it in.
You can for sure not bring it into Eretz Yisrael. You cannot bring. That's what you cannot bring truma from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael. All Rebbe is saying is that Surya in both dinim, Surya now is part of Eretz Yisrael. Either because again Rebbe holds that kibush yachad shemei kibush, or as we'll explain, because the rationale behind those takanas, dafka do not apply specifically to Surya.
And that goes even b'shinui?
Yeah,
Surya, if you were a way to do it b'shinui? Being that it's the Rabbanan?
No. B'chlal, Yakir is saying a good rule. Whenever there's a rabbinic prohibition, doing it b'shinui, as a rule, will make it permitted. But if there is a reason that we know of, and the doing it with the shinui will not address that reason, like you can't bring what we do know, you can't bring Peiroi Shvius to Chutz La'aretz. Why, Yakir? Because people are not going to treat it the way Peiroi Shvius should be. And if you bring it b'shinui, how will that help? It's not doing anything. Okay, says the Gemara. Yeah, let's begin. So. The reason we explained, the reason why Rebbe said that you can buy marketed vegetables in the Holy Land, miyad means Matzah Rosh Hashanah. Right away, right in the beginning of the 8th year, we said it's because Rebbe was the one that took away the prohibition of importing vegetables into the Holy Land. So let's learn about that. Right? We have to learn about what happened and why did he say so. So says the Gemara, you should know like this, Barishayna Hoya Hayarak Asur, that to import vegetables into Israel was, according to all opinions, prohibited. And not only was it prohibited for it to be imported inside what we will call central Eretz Yisrael, but Asur, I'm going to add the words afilu, even B'Sefare Eretz Yisrael. The word Sfar here means a border settlement. Now, why would we think it's different? We'll see in a moment, but we understand why you may not. The reason for this takana is...
I'm sorry. This seems a very peculiar distinction, because once you bring it in, once you give Rishus to bring it into the border settlement, what's to stop somebody from going farther in?
Okay, you're right.
Either all or nothing.
So like this, the Chachamim, as we know, were very sensitive to other secondary concerns, And sometimes they made such a differentiation, even though, Vlad, your concern cannot be fully resolved. And just to know, the difference will be is that we the Jewish people need for Jews to settle in the border cities. We need for that to happen. It actually brings safety to the Holy Land. People that would live in the border cities, the way things work, you have to be practical. If you live today, let's say today is different because we're mamash at war with them. But if there would not be war, when you live in a border city, it would not be uncommon for you to own fields that are in the other nation because you're right there. If you live on the border, you own land that's right there. So for me to tell you, you can live there, but you can't own land. Most business was they own land ownership and agriculture. No, since the people that lived in border cities, they own their own land, chutz la'aretz, because people cannot commute. I get it. You cannot commute 2 hours, but if you have to take a wagon for 15 minutes or for 10 minutes, that's where everyone works. You work near your home. So the Chachamim felt they cannot impose it on the border cities. Now, Vlad is making a good point. Once you bring it into the border cities, Taka could be you're going to bring it in further. And Achanami. But they said they felt that if they will prohibit it across the board, it will be harder to find Yidden that will live on the border cities, and that's a danger.
So was this prohibition based on Goyish product, or this permission? Sorry, was based on Goyish product or a Jewish product? Meaning,
no.
If I own land outside Chutz La'aretz, I bring it in. Okay, for me it's permitted. But if I buy from a Goy.
In other words, the prohibition has to do with that gush eretz amim, like Kevin had in the picture. You buy vegetables that comes with earth. Rabbinically, Vlad, the earth is tummy. The Yidden that lived on the borders, by the way, and they worked outside, they were not kohanim. They knew that. They became tamim midrabanan. They knew that. The reason, they did not say that gush eretz amim is tahar. They never said that. They said is you can import. And mistama, they would have to mark on the box that this comes from chutz la'aretz, and therefore kahanim cannot eat it. And it's more than that. If I take it and I move it around, before I go aliyas leregel, I have to go through the tara of the mechatos midrabana. In other words, it was for sure cheaper because it wasn't. You become tummy. But at least they allowed you to import it. What happened? Iskinu. So the next step was that hayarik mutar at least b'safari Eretz Yisrael. Now I want to say more to you what you're saying, Vlad. Once they were mattered that, they didn't say, Vlad, only from Jewish land. No, they didn't say that. Once they said that on the border cities, we're lifting the ban of importing, it doesn't make a difference whether it's growing in Jewish land or whether it's growing in not Jewish land. It didn't make a difference. They saw it's affecting people. People, I don't want to move there. Why don't you move there? Because I can't. I want to own land. I don't want to limit myself. Maybe the Adarabah, maybe land outside of Eretz Yisrael was even cheaper. Maybe. So that was a motivation for people to move to a border town for them to be able to buy cheaper land. And the Chazal wanted for Jews to live in border towns. Okay. The Afal Pikein, nevertheless, even when they took it down a notch, they didn't permit it across the board. Means to the center of Eretz Yisrael, any place which is within the border towns. Let's go weiter. Then at some point, at some point, they completely abolished this takana. Now, why did they abolish this takana? Simple. There wasn't enough local vegetables. Very simple. There wasn't enough food. Not everyone can afford meat. So at some point, they felt that they have to lift the ban. Now, lifting the ban doesn't mean that those vegetables were not tamim midrabanan, and they were. I'm saying people learn how to live with it. If it came from chutz la'aretz, there's a problem with tumah. Okay, so people knew that. Afal pikein, even after they abolished everything and they allowed imports, they still did not allow you to. Now, once you begin importing, the logic says, why would you have to wait in the 8th year? But they didn't lift that ban. That ban was put because of maybe it's tzvichim. Rebbe was the one that said, no, what this Braisa, what this Gemara is telling you, Rebbe was not the one that lifted the ban. Rebbe was the one that put two and two together. He says, now that we are allowed to import vegetables, make chutz la'aretz everywhere, so it doesn't make any more sense for us to have to wait Motzei Shvis. Rebbe hitir likach yara Motzei Shvis miyad. But he made one exception. Bar min kafluta. Rebbe did not allow for people to import leeks. Why? Because Rebbe saw that leeks were not imported. Go figure why. Ma ovdenle Tziporei. Now the residents in Tziporei, they were not happy that Rebbe did not permit leeks. So what did they do? So they took a leek, came and find a good picture of a leek, but then do the AI to what happened. And Al Bushe, they dressed the leek with a sack of a kitma. They put the leek in a sackcloth and they put ashes on it. And they brought the leek in front of Rebbe. So if you think people didn't have humor, those of us who learned here about the Rosh, this is our story with the Rabbi Zajac Shlita. They brought a leek and they dressed it up the leek. And what did this leek sin? In other words, the leek was lamenting that I'm like banned. When Rebbe saw that, he was matter the leeks. Ushralin loin gavaldik. Okay. In other words, what they did was, guys, it wasn't that they nebach leeks. They convinced Rebbe that people are importing leeks. That's what they needed to do. Once Rebbe found out that they are importing leeks, then he lifted the ban. Rebbe made that link. Weiter story. Ula bar Yishmael says in the name of Rabbi Chanina that you should know, Rabbi HaKadosh, and Rabbi Yossi, this must have been at the end of their lives. By Yehuda, they once went to Akko. Now, guys, we already learned that Akko is the border, right? Now, they went there right after Shviz. Viskablon Gabi Rabbi Mana, who hosted them? Rabbi Mana. And Omar Rebbe, or Amar Le Rebbe told his host, Rebbe asked Rabbi Mana, Asi lanu lefes echad shel yarak. Can you prepare for us a pan of vegetables? So Avad Le Kupad, he made a dish of meat. The host gave them meat, did not give them vegetables. Amar Le, Rebbe again the next day told his host, Rabbi Mana, Asi lanu lefes echad shel yarak. Again, please make for us a dish of vegetables. So what did he do today? Asaloin tanagulta. He made them a chicken. No, he was not giving them what they were asking. Amar Rebbe says, Niker, who's that? Our host must have been that he comes from the door of Shmuel. Now, there's so many different approaches of Wukum Tarain Shmuel. First of all, one approach in the Pnei Moshe is that Shmuel was a Roife Mumcha. That we know. Shmuel healed Ravna. And Shmuel, because of being a doctor, Chevre, gird your loins for this, held that vegetables are not good for your body. Meat and schnitzel is good for your body. So Rebbe had gebetet in one thing. Shmuel, as a doctor, knew it's better. Now, if that would have been the case, then what does that have to do with our sugya? And that's what the Pnei Moshe says. The Rashirilio says, no. He says that it's amazing. Rebbe was the one that was mater sfichim. And if Shmuel disagreed with that, now Shmuel is an Amoira. Shmuel disagreed with the heter of Rebbe that since you are allowed to import Yerakos from Chutz La'aretz, so you can buy any vegetables in the market right after Shvius. Shmuel did not hold by that. That is the meaning. So Rebbe was not upset. He says it looks like he's following Shmuel. Don't forget, Rav is a Talmud of Rebbe, and Shmuel is the Bar Plukta of Rav. Rav paskant like Rebbe, and Shmuel argued. That is what he said. So Amalei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Afilu mi Pesach Shmuel einoi. That's not true. Don't connect Rabbi Mana's not giving you your dish of vegetables. It's not connected. No. Why? Let's go further. Even if he would have held Shmuel did not agree with Rebbe, Vlad. But Shmuel held, like we just learned in the Gemara, that border cities were allowed to import vegetables. Akkoy was a border city. So it flows. Forget about the doctor part. Not forget, the Pnei Moshe says it, but let's go with the Rashirilio. Don't connect this to Shmuel. Shmuel argues with Rebbe. But even Shmuel agreed that border towns can import. And Akko is a border town. So why was he not giving the dish that he was asking? So V'lama Avat Kain, do Talmud min Talmidei de Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbi Yehuda Amar, Hayarik Asad, even Bisfari Eretz Yisrael. That's the Chiddush. That's how machmer he was. Rav Amana argued with what we learned above, which is a big Chiddush. And Kadas Aligabei, when Rav Amana once came to Rebbe on a different occasion, Tenei Le'uvda, Rav Amana remember the time you came to me and I didn't give you vegetables, I only gave you meat and I gave you a chicken? Amalei, Sarech, Havesa, Avid, Kivasin, you should have given us what we asked you to. Rabbi was upset with him for that. It was even though Rav Mana held like Rabbi Yehuda argues with what we learned before. Rabbi Yehuda holds not only not like Rabbi, but not even in the border towns can you import vegetables. Nevertheless, Rabbi says, when I'm a guest in your house, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, he was from the Tanoim. He was the elder.
He is a guest.
Beautiful. So, and the vart is that when a Rebbe comes to a chassid, who's the guest? The chassid is the guest. The Rebbe is the balabas. All right, we'll stop over here because it's